Barack Obama looked directly at JD Vance and told him not to lecture a community organizer about community, delivering the line with the polished confidence of a man who had spent decades turning political theater into personal mythology. The gallery erupted before the sentence had fully settled, and within 4 minutes the clip had been shared more than 60,000 times because the audience believed it had just witnessed another flawless Obama takedown. Obama still possessed the voice, the timing, the controlled pause, and that slight downward tilt of the microphone that made every closing word feel less like an argument and more like a verdict. Nobody in modern American politics could wrap superiority in warmth as efficiently as Barack Obama, and almost nobody could make an insult sound like a civic lesson. But JD Vance was not studying Obama's posture, waiting for applause, or preparing a clever comeback because JD Vance was looking at the laptop in front of him. On that screen sat one number, public, verifiable, and harder than every elegant phrase Obama had spent a lifetime perfecting. It was not a secret recording, a hidden scandal, or a partisan accusation that could be dismissed as another manufactured outrage from the opposing side. It was a number connected to an address on the south side of Chicago, the same South Side Obama had invoked for decades as proof of his loyalty, credibility, and moral authority. Obama could challenge motives, redefine questions, and lift an audience above uncomfortable details with soaring language. But he could not inspire a number into becoming something else. A number does not care about cadence, biography, symbolism, or legacy, and this one was attached to the most expensive project Obama had ever built in the neighborhood he claimed to represent. The event had been advertised as a respectable conversation about civic engagement, presidential legacies, and the newly opened Obama Presidential Center with a neutral moderator seated between the former president and the vice president. The center had opened 4 weeks earlier, and the timing of the appearance was clearly designed to reinforce the celebration before serious scrutiny could interfere with the preferred narrative. Obama entered the room with the familiar gravity of a man who had once controlled the world's most powerful office and had never completely surrendered the stage that came with it. He crossed his legs, adjusted his microphone, and settled into the chair with the effortless precision of someone who had survived thousands of interviews without ever appearing to work for control. JD Vance sat across from him with an open ThinkPad and a spreadsheet, creating a contrast so severe that it looked less like a debate than an expensive monument facing an unpaid invoice. Obama opened with 4 minutes of practiced eloquence about the South Side, the organizers who shaped him, the young people who would enter the center, and the democratic promise supposedly represented by the building. His voice rose and softened in exactly the right places, filling the room with the emotional rhythm that had carried him from Illinois politics to the White House. He repeatedly invoked this community, described the center as part of our story, and declared his faith in the people of Chicago, while the gallery responded as if every familiar phrase had just been discovered. Then Obama turned toward Vance with the paternal expression of a senior statesman preparing to explain morality to a younger man whose life had supposedly been formed in the wrong region. The vice president grew up in Appalachia. I respect that story, but I spent my career in neighborhoods like this one, organizing, knocking on doors, learning what community means from the people who built it, not from a book deal about it. So, with all due respect, Mr. Vice President, don't tell me about community. The room exploded, not with ordinary applause, but with the sound of an audience convinced that its champion had completed the humiliation before the discussion had truly begun. Obama's staff watched from the side and saw the exact frame they had expected, the legendary organizer restoring the hierarchy while the younger Republican absorbed the lesson. JD Vance waited 5 seconds, allowing the applause to expose how little interest the room had in examining anything beneath the performance. He did not defend his book, his childhood, Appalachia, or the legitimacy of his own understanding of struggling communities, because answering Obama's insult would have accepted Obama's terms. Instead, without changing his expression or raising his voice, JD Vance asked, "Mr. President, where do you live?" 4 words emptied the room of celebration because the honest answer was not Woodlawn, South Shore, Inglewood, or any other neighborhood Obama had placed at the center of his political identity. The answer was Martha's Vineyard, where Obama owned an estate purchased for approximately $11,750,000 on an island with a median home price above $1 million. Obama smiled, the professional smile of a politician who recognized the trap but still believed his experience could carry him around it. "I live where my family lives. The question is not where I sleep. The question is where I serve." JD Vance did not challenge the sentiment because he immediately moved from where Obama slept to what Obama had built in the place where he claimed to serve. The Obama Presidential Center had opened on June 19, 2026, occupying 19.3 acres of Jackson Park on Chicago's South Side. It had originally been presented as a $300 million project, but the final cost had climbed to approximately $850 million, making it the most expensive presidential center ever constructed. JD Vance allowed that figure to remain in the air long enough for the audience to compare it with the surrounding neighborhood, where the median household income stood near $35,000 and roughly 1 in 4 residents lived below the poverty line. $850 million does not sound like community service when placed beside families calculating rent, groceries, transit costs, and overdue utility bills every month. It sounds like institutional vanity wearing the language of public uplift while demanding that everyone nearby admire the architecture and ignore the arithmetic. The Obama Foundation had repeatedly emphasized that the center was privately funded and had received no taxpayer money, a claim designed to end the financial discussion before anyone examined the infrastructure surrounding the project. JD Vance opened another tab and pointed to more than $350 million spent by Illinois and Chicago on roads, transit connections, utility relocations, overpasses, and other improvements directly tied to the center. Those expenditures came from the public, yet no city, state, or foundation official had produced a single consolidated total showing taxpayers exactly how much they had committed to supporting this supposedly private project. Calling the building privately funded while taxpayers financed the systems required to reach, operate, and sustain it was not transparency, but a carefully engineered distinction intended to survive headlines rather than scrutiny. If a private owner constructs a house while the public finances the roads, bridges, sewers, and transit around it, the word private has been stretched until it becomes nearly meaningless. Then, JD Vance introduced Denise Williams, a retired nurse who had lived in Woodlawn for 40 years and had spent 36 years working at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Before construction began in 2019, Denise paid approximately $1,200 per month in rent, but by the time the center opened, that rent had risen to $1,850. That was a 54% increase for a woman whose decades of service had not produced an income capable of rising at the same speed as the neighborhood's new prestige. Her daughter and granddaughter had already moved away because they could no longer afford to remain near the streets where their family had built its life. Obama had once knocked on doors in communities like hers, but the project built in his name had made remaining behind those doors increasingly expensive. Obama leaned forward with the posture that usually signaled the beginning of a polished answer about investment, opportunity, youth programming, tourism, jobs, and the long-term renewal of the South Side. He began describing the presidential center as an investment in the community, repeating the familiar promise that large institutions always make when the costs are immediate, but the benefits remain safely projected into the future. JD Vance did not expand the exchange or invent another speech for him because the existing facts required only one direct question. "Mr. President, Denise's rent went up 54%. Is that the investment? The question stopped the performance because Denise's rent was not a vision, a symbol, or a paragraph about hope, but a bill that had already arrived. The force of the question came from its refusal to remain inside the language Obama preferred, because investment sounded noble until it was translated into the monthly rent paid by a retired nurse. Denise Williams did not receive a press release, a ceremonial ribbon, or a projected economic benefit spread across 10 years, but she did receive a 54% increase that changed what her family could afford. The center could promise jobs, tourism, and opportunity, yet none of those promises erase the fact that one of the neighborhood's longtime residents was already paying more to remain near the project built in the name of her community. Obama could describe the future in broad, uplifting terms, but JD Vance kept dragging the discussion back to the people absorbing the cost in the present. That was the problem with Denise's rent. It turned an abstract defense of development into a specific invoice with a specific name attached to it. JD Vance opened another tab and moved from the cost of living beside the center to the cost of the land beneath it. The Obama Presidential Center occupied 19.3 acres of Jackson Park, publicly owned land maintained for generations through public money and intended to serve the residents of Chicago. The park had been designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in the 19th century, and its value did not come only from acreage, but from its civic purpose, public history, and permanent place in the city. The Obama Foundation received a 99-year lease on that land for $10 without a competitive auction that might have shown what another buyer would pay. $10 for nearly a century of control over 19.3 acres of public parkland was not a market transaction, but a political favor disguised as paperwork. The estimated market value of comparable land in the area ranged from approximately $20 million to $50 million, yet the foundation paid less than many Chicago residents spend on lunch. The difference between $10 and tens of millions did not disappear, simply because the city council approved the agreement, because approval does not convert a subsidy into fair value. Public property worth millions had been transferred for almost nothing to a private foundation controlled by one of the most influential political figures in the country. The taxpayers of Chicago surrendered the economic value, while the foundation received the location, prestige, and control needed to build the most expensive presidential center in American history. The people being told that the project belonged to them were also the people who had given away the land beneath it. Denise Williams had paid property taxes for decades, and those taxes helped maintain Jackson Park long before the Obama Foundation arrived with architects, donors, and an $850 million plan. She had contributed more to the public system supporting the park than the foundation paid for 99 years of possession. JD Vance reduced the arrangement to the kind of comparison that no communications office could soften. Denise paid more for one monthly transit pass than the Obama Foundation paid for nearly a century of public land. The comparison was devastating because it required no ideological commitment, legal theory, or partisan loyalty to understand. A retired nurse paid more to ride a city bus for 1 month than a powerful private foundation paid to control 19.3 acres of her city for 99 years. Obama responded with the projected economic benefit, arguing that the presidential center would generate an estimated $3.1 billion in activity over the following decade. He emphasized that the estimate came from the University of Chicago and presented the infrastructure spending as a long overdue investment in the South Side. The number sounded impressive because $3.1 billion is large enough to make almost any project appear self-justifying when the distribution of that money remains undefined. JD Vance did not dispute the projection or pretend that economic activity had no value, because the more important issue was hidden inside the phrase itself. Mr. President, who receives the $3.1 billion, That question exposed the weakness in the defense because economic activity and economic benefit are not the same thing, especially in a neighborhood experiencing rapid increases in property values and rent. Money can circulate through developers, contractors, new businesses, outside investors, and future property owners without meaningfully improving the lives of residents who were there before the investment arrived. A neighborhood can become more profitable while becoming less affordable, and politicians can celebrate growth while the families used to justify the project are quietly pushed beyond its borders. $3.1 billion moving through Woodlawn and South Shore did not automatically mean $3.1 billion flowing to the people currently living in Woodlawn and South Shore. Without a clear answer about who received the money, the figure functioned less like proof of community benefit and more like a shield against questions about displacement. JD Vance understood that distinction because places described as economically renewed often look very different from the perspective of the residents being priced out. Development can bring restaurants, offices, visitors, and rising property values while leaving longtime families unable to shop, work, or remain in the neighborhood being celebrated. The political language calls this revitalization, but the people packing their belongings because the rent has climbed beyond their income experience it as removal. Obama's answer described what the center could attract, while Vance's question demanded to know who would still be present to enjoy it. The gap between those two ideas was the same gap between a public ceremony praising opportunity and Denise Williams watching her daughter and granddaughter move away. Obama did not directly identify who would receive the projected $3.1 billion and instead shifted toward youth mentorship, job training, educational programming, and community access. The pivot was smooth because Obama had spent years mastering the transition from a narrow question he did not want to answer to a broader moral argument he could control. Under normal conditions, the redirection would have worked because the audience would have followed the familiar cadence and treated the change of subject as an expansion of the discussion. But the room had already been shown the lease, the public infrastructure costs, the increase in Denise's rent, and the difference between economic activity and benefit. Once the pivot became visible, it stopped looking like leadership and started looking like avoidance. JD Vance did not need to accuse Obama of evasion because the absence of an answer was obvious enough on its own. He simply continued through the records, allowing each public fact to narrow the space available for rhetorical escape. The center stood on land leased for $10, relied on hundreds of millions in publicly funded infrastructure, and opened in neighborhoods where rents had risen far faster than the citywide average. Supporters could praise the architecture and programming, but they still had not explained why the people who provided the land and absorbed the higher costs should accept promises while others secured the assets. Every attempt to return the conversation to inspiration only made the unanswered arithmetic more visible. Then, JD Vance opened the tab that changed the argument from land use and neighborhood displacement to institutional identity and federal oversight. He said he wanted to discuss what the Obama Presidential Center was not, because the title encouraged the public to assume that it functioned like every other presidential library in the country. Other presidential libraries operate within the National Archives and Records Administration system, preserving records, supporting research, and accepting federal rules tied to their public mission. The Obama Presidential Center did not belong to that system, and the presidential records from the Obama administration were not housed inside the building carrying Obama's name. At that moment, the question was no longer only how much the center had cost, but what the public had actually received in exchange for the money, land, and authority committed to it. In 2017, the Obama Foundation chose not to place the center inside the National Archives and Records Administration system, a decision with consequences far beyond branding. By stepping outside that structure, the foundation avoided federal requirements applied to presidential libraries, including an endowment, equal to 60% of construction costs. At a final project cost of approximately $850 million, that endowment would have required roughly $510 million. The choice preserved enormous financial flexibility while freeing the foundation from oversight other presidential libraries accept. The public received something called a presidential center, but without the records, standards, and accountability most people associate with a presidential library. The Obama administration's presidential records remained under National Archives control in a separate facility outside Chicago. They were not stored inside the monument built in Obama's name, despite the expectation created by that name. Visitors could enter a museum, use a basketball court, see a vegetable garden, reach a rooftop playground, and look at a sledding hill, but they could not access the primary documents of the 44th president there. The center also served as headquarters for the Obama Foundation, giving a private organization a permanent base on public land. What had been sold through the language of presidential history was, in practice, a private foundation complex with a museum attached. JD Vance did not need to exaggerate the contrast because the facts were severe enough. A traditional presidential library preserves records, supports researchers, accepts federal standards, and guarantees public access to an administration's documentary history. The Obama Presidential Center rejected that model, kept the records elsewhere, and chose a structure allowing more control over design, programming, and mission. That choice may have been legal, but legality did not answer what the public had been led to believe it was receiving. The name suggested one institution, while the operating model delivered another. The financial consequence was equally difficult to dismiss. Avoiding the National Archive system meant avoiding a $510 million endowment requirement that would have forced the foundation to secure a massive reserve. Instead, the foundation could spend on the building, granite tower, recreational spaces, landscaping, and headquarters without carrying the same obligation imposed on other presidential libraries. That was not a minor technical adjustment buried in paperwork, but a decision worth more than $500 million. JD Vance forced the audience to consider whether the project had taken the prestige of a presidential institution while rejecting the rules that normally justified it. Then the discussion moved to the foundation's tax-exempt status under Section 501c and 3, which depended on its educational mission. Education under the law is not a decorative word that can be attached to any expensive public-facing project because it includes youth programs and museum exhibits. The question was whether a center without presidential records, outside the federal library system, and built around a private foundation headquarters truly operated in the manner implied by its tax treatment. Basketball courts, gardens, playgrounds, and sledding hills could serve a community, but they did not automatically establish research, scholarship, or access to primary documents. JD Vance was not attacking recreation, but the use of educational language as a shield for an institution that had chosen not to keep the president's papers on site. The center's defenders could point to mentorship, exhibitions, and public events, yet those features did not erase the contradiction. A private museum can educate and a foundation can train young people, but neither function automatically turns the building into the presidential institution its name encourages the public to imagine. An $850 million complex with a 225-foot granite tower demanded more than broad assurances about inspiration. It demanded an explanation of why taxpayers should finance surrounding infrastructure and surrender public land for $10, while the institution remained free from federal obligations accepted by its predecessors. The sharper question was whether the educational mission matched the center's actual priorities, spending, and design. JD Vance then opened the final tab, shifting from institutional structure to the treatment of businesses the project claimed it would uplift. In early 2025, a black-owned concrete and rebar company working on the center filed a $40 million lawsuit. The company alleged that the construction manager undermined the Obama Foundation's diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments by singling out black-owned firms for errors while overlooking similar errors by non-black firms. The allegation struck directly at the project's promoted identity of racial equity, community empowerment, and change within the construction industry. A center honoring the first black president, built in a black neighborhood, now faced an accusation that a black-owned contractor had been treated unfairly during construction. The lawsuit required no partisan embellishment because the contradiction was devastating by itself. The Obama Foundation had tied the project to racial progress and local opportunity, making those promises part of its justification for receiving extraordinary support. If the company proved it had been held to a different standard, the Foundation's commitments would expose a gap between the values advertised to the community and the practices carried out under its name. $40 million was not a symbolic complaint, and another ceremony about diversity could not make the allegation disappear. The project's own moral language had created the standard against which its conduct was now being measured. JD Vance closed the laptop for the first time that evening, marking the end of the evidence rather than another performance. He accepted that the young organizer working in Chicago during the 1980s may have genuinely cared about the people whose doors he knocked on. But he separated that organizer from the man associated with an $850 million center built on public parkland leased for $10, surrounded by taxpayer-funded infrastructure and located beside residents facing steep rent increases. He pointed to the decision to avoid federal oversight, the $510 million endowment requirement, and the lawsuit from a black-owned contractor as evidence that the institution no longer resembled the moral story used to defend it. The accusation was not that Obama had never cared, but that the man who organized in Woodlawn and the man who built the center in Woodlawn no longer appeared to be the same person. Denise Williams remained the clearest proof because her life reduced every abstract offense to a monthly bill. The organizer, who knocked on doors in neighborhoods like hers, asked residents to believe politics could protect their dignity and expand their power. The former president who built the center presided over a project that increased the neighborhood's prestige while families like Denise's struggled to remain close enough to benefit. Her daughter and granddaughter had already left, and no projection about tourism or economic activity could move them back into a neighborhood they could no longer afford. When JD Vance finished, the issue was no longer whether Barack Obama could deliver the better speech, but whether any speech could reconcile the promise made at those doors with the price now attached to living behind them. Barack Obama answered, and the response was exactly what his reputation promised: polished, elevated, emotionally precise, and almost completely detached from the numbers JD Vance had placed in front of him. He spoke about legacy, the responsibility to build institutions that outlast a political career, and the young girl from Inglewood who might enter the center and see a president who looked like her reflected in the national story. He returned to the arc of justice, the stubborn belief that progress remains possible, and the familiar idea that cynicism must never be allowed to defeat hope. Every pause landed where it was supposed to land, every rise in his voice signaled moral urgency, and every softened phrase invited the room to remember why Barack Obama had once been considered the most effective political speaker of his generation. It was a beautiful speech, but beauty was no longer the standard by which the room was judging him. The audience had already heard $10 for 99 years of public land, $850 million in construction, more than $350 million in taxpayer-supported infrastructure, a 54% rent increase, and a $40 million discrimination lawsuit. None of those numbers had been answered, reduced, corrected, or meaningfully challenged by Obama's final appeal. His speech floated above them, elegant and untouched, while the numbers remained on the floor where everyone could see them. The standing ovation that normally arrived before Obama completed his final sentence never formed, and the applause that did begin remained thin, scattered, and painfully aware of itself. For perhaps the first time in Barack Obama's public career, the room had received the full power of his rhetoric and refused to confuse that power with a response. JD Vance said nothing because saying anything more would have weakened the contrast already visible in the room. He closed his laptop, took a drink of water, and placed the glass back on the table with the ordinary movements of a man who had finished reading an account and found the balance impossible to defend. There was no dramatic interruption, no shouted accusation, and no theatrical walkout designed to manufacture a clip. Obama had delivered the superior performance, but Vance had delivered the unanswered evidence, and the audience understood that those were no longer the same competition. The silence following Obama's speech became more damaging than any insult Vance could have added. At the side of the room, Obama's communication staff began confronting a problem their prepared strategy had not anticipated. A fundraising email had already been drafted around the expected headline of Obama defeating Vance in a public confrontation, but sending it after a discussion dominated by the cost of Obama's own center risked turning the appeal into another object of ridicule. The message remained unsent, not because the event had officially ended in disaster, but because the team could no longer predict which part of the evening the public would remember. They had expected the viral moment to be Obama dismissing Vance as a man who learned community from a book deal. Instead, the defining image became Obama giving one of his finest speeches to a room that had stopped following him. That clip spread first, and it spread because of what happened after the speech rather than because of anything contained within it. Viewers watched Obama invoke history, representation, and justice, then watched the gallery fail to rise with the enthusiasm his speeches had commanded for years. The absence of reaction became the reaction, and the clip accumulated millions of views under a brutal description: the speech that failed. Obama's words were not clumsy, confused, or weak, which made the failure more revealing rather than less. The greatest political speaker in the room had spoken at full strength, and the numbers still remained stronger. The second clip focused on the lease, reducing the entire arrangement to the fact that the Obama Foundation had obtained 19.3 acres of public parkland for $10 over 99 years. That segment moved beyond national partisan media and entered forums devoted to municipal policy, public land, zoning, and urban development. City officials and local activists who dealt with property transfers every day understood how extraordinary the terms appeared without needing JD Vance to explain the politics behind them. Within a week, 3 Chicago aldermen called for a public review of the lease and the process through which it had been approved. Once the transaction was presented without ceremony, the $10 figure became almost impossible to defend as ordinary public administration. The third clip belonged to Denise Williams because her monthly transit pass provided a comparison more effective than 1,000 pages of foundation documents. A retired nurse paid more to ride public transportation for 1 month than the Obama Foundation paid for 99 years of control over her parkland. The comparison spread as simple arithmetic, stripped of speeches, party labels, and institutional language. People did not need to understand federal archives law, tax-exempt organizations, or the structure of presidential foundations to understand that $15 was more than $10. The absurdity was contained inside the numbers, and every attempt to explain it only repeated the comparison. During the first week, 4 senators, including Republicans and independents, requested that the Government Accountability Office compile a consolidated account of taxpayer-funded infrastructure connected to the center. The request focused on the fact that no single state agency, city department, or foundation report had publicly presented the full amount spent on roads, transit, utilities, and related work. The procedural nature of the request made it more dangerous because it did not depend on proving corruption, conspiracy, or criminal conduct. It asked only for the total, and the fact that such a total was not already available became part of the controversy. A project celebrated as privately financed was now facing a federal request to calculate the public bill surrounding it. A tax-exempt organization watchdog also submitted a complaint asking the Internal Revenue Service to examine whether the Obama Foundation's operational profile remained consistent with its claimed educational purpose. The complaint emphasized that the center did not house presidential records, had chosen to remain outside the National Archive system, and functioned as a museum, foundation headquarters, and recreational complex. It questioned whether the foundation had accepted the privileges of a charitable educational institution while avoiding the obligations normally attached to a presidential library. The IRS did not announce a conclusion, but it acknowledged the complaint, ensuring that the question would not disappear with the closing of the town hall. What had begun as a political challenge had now entered the slower and less forgiving language of regulatory scrutiny. During the second week, Chicago aldermen introduced a resolution requiring future transfers of public land to private foundations to include fair market value assessments and competitive bidding. The resolution did not cancel the Obama lease, but its purpose was obvious because governments do not create new safeguards unless an earlier transaction has exposed a weakness. Without naming Obama directly, the city was considering rules designed to prevent another politically connected foundation from receiving public land on similarly generous terms. At the same time, the $40 million lawsuit filed by the black-owned concrete and rebar company moved into discovery, with attorneys seeking internal communications about diversity commitments and contractor treatment. A project built around the language of racial equity now faced the possibility that its own private records would reveal how those promises were applied when money, deadlines, and institutional protection were at stake. By the third week, housing data from Woodlawn and South Shore gave statistical weight to what Denise Williams had already experienced personally. Average rents in Woodlawn had reportedly risen 48% since 2019, while South Shore rents had increased 31%, compared with a citywide increase of 19%. The data did not prove that the presidential center alone caused every increase, but it confirmed that displacement concerns were not imaginary inventions created for a television confrontation. Obama's foundation responded by highlighting visitors, youth programs, community events, and future economic potential, all of which described institutional output without confronting neighborhood outcome. Visits, exhibits, and ribbon cuttings could be counted, but so could rent increases, departures, and families no longer able to remain near the investment supposedly created for them. Barack Obama did not lose the ability to speak that night, and he did not suddenly become less intelligent, less experienced, or less commanding than he had been before the event began. What changed was the audience's willingness to accept eloquence as a substitute for an accounting. JD Vance had taken a center wrapped in legacy, hope, representation, and community pride, then reduced it to land, money, oversight, rent, and institutional obligation. Obama's speech remained beautiful, but beautiful and true were not automatically the same thing, and no amount of cadence could force them back together once the distinction had been exposed. In a room on Chicago's South Side, a laptop, a retired nurse, and a handful of public numbers proved that even the most gifted voice in American politics could not talk an unpaid invoice out of existence.